Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome back to what is the first unit of, still the first unit of 11th grade, where we are walking through poems. We just finished, if you're following along in order with the class, we just finished the poem Baron and Luthien by J.R.R. Tolkien. And today what we're going to do is we're going to actually walk through a poem that's much more famous, but is also very, very different, almost like completely different in its tone and its subject matter. And that's Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through the poem in a relatively good pace. We're not going to go too slow on it or too fast. Try not to, at least. And we're going to fill out the right half of this poetry mapping sheet that we started with Baron and Luthien. You'll remember that we went through and we added to each of these boxes, talking about the rhyme scheme and the rhyme scheme's effect on the poem and what kind of influence it has on the reader, how it might relate to the actual, the whole ideas, the whole general idea or theme behind the poem as well. And then we're going to, for number two, look for three really dominant literary elements in this poem. We're not going to go through, I think, like the original directions said, and label the elements being used in each stanza, although I'm going to do a much quicker version of that here. But we want to do whatever ones, we want to identify whatever elements are going to be the most prevalent here, okay? And then, of course, we're going to look for any kind of theme or just idea that the poem seems to be pushing or seems to be expressing. So let's take a look. First of all, a couple things. We have the title, the poem, and all this kind of stuff. And most of us have a familiarity with Edgar Allan Poe by this point in high school, because, of course, this is 11th grade now. And I mean, most of us have read at least The Mask of the Red Death, The Telltale Heart, or The Cask of Amontillado, or something like that. And we know that Edgar Allan Poe is associated with Gothic literature. We know that he comes from the 1800s, America. He's one of the top five, I would say, American writers. And he's probably most famous for this poem in particular. We, of course, know the Baltimore Ravens, right? If you're a fan of them, then you innately are actually kind of connected to this poem because this is the poem which those people or that particular team is named after. And why is that? Of course, because Edgar Allan Poe is from Baltimore, okay, associated very much with Baltimore. So we know him. We know that he works with the Gothic. We know that the Gothic is his genre of choice. So we can expect Gothic-like elements here, such as a focus on the macabre, a very either dreary, solemn, or dark sort of mood. So prepare for this. And then, of course, the title, The Raven. We are focusing on an animal, essentially, a bird that is the raven. And what sort of role do ravens have in terms of symbolism here? Well, right off the bat, we know that they're blackbirds, so they're similar to crows. So they're kind of somewhat associated with something dark, usually evil, or just at least associated with the macabre. They're also associated, being birds, they're associated with something that is spiritual. They're associated with the spiritual realm. In terms of deeper kind of illusions, my mind jumps right to the ravens of Odin that are used as sort of figures to kind of see farther into the future or act as all-seeing ravens. That's going to kind of come up in an alternative form later in the poem, so keep that in mind. So let's jump right in. The narrator says, "Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many a quaint and curious volumes of forgotten lore, while I nodded nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone great gently rapping at my chamber door. 'Tis some visitor," I muttered, "tapping at my chamber door, only this and nothing more." Okay, so we have off the bat a typical feature of 1800s literature, particularly of Edgar Allan Poe's literature, which is a first-person narrative. The narrator of this poem is the actual the character in the poem. Okay, so we assume that it's a he, is sitting around on a midnight dreary, pondering quaint and curious volumes of forgotten lore, and he's nodding, he's napping, and then he hears something rapping and tapping at his chamber door, thinking that it's just some visitor. Okay, so right off the bat, a couple things that jump out are, of course, the midnight dreary, pondering, weak and weary. So he's kind of this weak, weary, I assume older guy, or just kind of tired guy sitting here reading volumes of forgotten lore, older things, okay, older, perhaps darker things in the midnight hours, okay, so deep into the night he is doing this. And here's the wrapping. There's a visitor. Let's see what's going on. And also, by the way, let's jump right before, let's get this right out of the way. The structure of the rhyme scheme, very, very unique, very, very different here. Once upon a midnight dreary, let's take a look at the end. Weary, lore, tapping, door, and more. Okay, so weary, we would give that an A. Lore, we would give that a B. Tapping, we would give that a C. Door, we would give that a B, and then a B, and a B more, okay? So A, B, C, B, B, B. Interesting. Although you might have noticed, if you're really kind of sharpening your ears here, you'll notice that something else is going on. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary over many of quaint and curious ponderings of forgotten lore. That's a little bit of internal rhyme, okay? We have a word within, kind of at the center of one of our lines in the poem, actually rhyming with the final, the dominant rhyme scheme, the dominant rhyme of that particular line. So Edgar Allan Poe is using a little bit of internal rhyme here. We're going to see what sort of effect that creates later in the poem. Distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow. Sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here forevermore. Okay? All right. Again, with the setting and the effect that it has on the mood, it's in the bleak December. And the dying embers, right? The imagery here is of that it's getting late in the night. There is no brightness in this man's life or in the room. It is all just kind of dying out. It's rotting their ghosts on the floor, kind of casting, pale shadows all over the place. So it's this generally very dour, downcasting sort of place. And he is what? Eagerly wishing the morrow. He really wishes that the next day would just come. And he is vainly seeking what? Seeking to borrow surcease, a pause, a kind of like respite of his sorrow, of his depression over what? Over the loss of someone named Lenore, this rare and radiant maiden who the angels named Lenore, nameless here forevermore. Lost Lenore. Now, does this mean Lenore is dead? Obviously, we can kind of, put two and two together and think that this is probably a romantic interest, at least an affectionate interest. And she's gone. We don't know if she's dead. We don't know if she's rejected him. But I personally think, because Edgar Allan Poe, I think that he's talking about someone that he knows who has died here. Okay, at least the narrator is. Next one. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This it is, and nothing more." Okay, so the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terror. So he gets up, to kind of go and see what's going on with this knocking at the door. And what happens? He kind of just is a little bit afraid of all of the different kind of moody atmosphere of the curtains rustling and the sadness of it all. And it's like making him feel fantastic terrors. Okay, so he's a little bit skittish here at this point. Now, a couple things. We can hear in that first line especially, and the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors. You can see that he is utilizing a little bit of alliteration. He's using a repetition of a consonant sound there. Again, giving this very, very brilliant sort of rhythmic feeling to the poems. One of the reasons why it's just so famous, it's so popular. It just sounds great. It's so easy to kind of recite because it just flows right off the tongue. A couple other things. Purple curtains. I'm going to do the English teacher thing, right? Is it a purple curtain just purple? No, the purple is a symbol for wealth, for mystery, for all this other kind of stuff. So it just kind of adds that mystique and that kind of mystical atmosphere here. And he comes over to see who is it that is knocking at the door. Let's take a look. Presently, my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," I said, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore, but the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there and nothing more." He gets up, kind of bucks up a little bit, tells the person, sorry, comes to open the door. No one there, okay? darkness there and nothing more. A little bit mysterious, right? Like, what the heck? Who is knocking at the door, right? Kind of spooky. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, Lenore? This I whispered, and an echo murmured back, Lenore! Merely this and nothing more. Okay? So he's sitting out there looking into that deep darkness, right? Saying, Lenore, was it Lenore? Was it her ghost? Or was it her, returned from wherever she may be? This I whispered, and the echo murmured back the word Lenore. Okay. So we get here an interesting kind of symbolic sort of setup. So he gets up, he opens the door. We have, again, this metaphor of life, right? This safety within, darkness and the unknown without. He looks out, it's darkness, he doesn't see anything. He whispers, Lenore, like, are you out there, Lenore? And he hears just an echo, just his own voice echo back, Lenore, okay? Merely this and nothing more. Interesting. So keep this imagery in mind. He's essentially talking to himself here out in the darkness. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning. Soon again I heard a tapping, somewhat louder than before. Surely, said I, surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what thereat is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment, and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind and nothing more. Okay, so now we understand. He goes back inside. Oh, it's something at the window lattice, something at the lattice, kind of like the latch on the window. Let's go see what that is. Open here I flung the shutter. Then, when, with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Okay, so he opens the door, the window door, and in comes a raven, the titular raven. And it's described as stately, of the stately days of yore. So it looks very kind of, regal and elegant. It flies in and it stoops on a bust of Pallas, a kind of statue of the upper portion of body of Pallas. Who is Pallas? Pallas is, of course, an allusion to the goddess, or an alternative name, a more kind of archaic and very Greek name for the goddess Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warfare and protection. Okay. So it's an interesting kind of contrast we have here, because obviously the allusion to Athena is very much meant to evoke a lot of symbolic meaning, as any Greek god or deity does when they are evoked. So let's take a look at that for a minute. Why Pallas Athena? Well, Athena, like we said, associated first and foremost with wisdom, which is interesting because it's wisdom and strategy. So there's some kind of association here with this raven, this symbol of death, or at least kind of farsightedness, sitting on the goddess of wisdom. Okay. Now, like, you can just tie yourself up in so many different ways of how to interpret that. Does that mean that the raven is going to speak wisdom to us? Does that mean that the raven, a symbol more of death and kind of stuff like that, this dark figure, is going to be oppressing wisdom and now is kind of like, dominant over the statue? Is that what it's saying? I don't know, because I'm tempted to say the latter, because if it were a bird that was going to be associated with Athena, it should have been an owl. That's her bird. So interesting. Now, on top of that, Athena also is the goddess of, yes, strategic, wise warfare, but also the goddess of protection in warfare. So she is like one of the famous virgin goddesses that you would pray for to protect your city. Now, interesting that this intruder from the outside comes in and puts himself on top of the bust of this goddess of protection, almost in mockery, right? So I don't know if it's meant to be a positive image here, but keep this in mind, okay? Perched and sat and nothing more. Then this ebony bird beguiling my sad fancy into smiling by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore, Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou, I said, art sure no craven, ghastly, grim, and ancient raven, wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Okay, so famous retort from the raven. What's going on here? He notices that the raven is beautiful, right? Stately kind of countenance, decorum, right? In other words, he says, you can't be a craven. You can't be something bad, right? Ghastly, grim, and ancient raven, even though you look ghastly and grim while also looking, very stately, you're not a negative figure, right? Let's see. Well, he says, who are you? Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore. So first of all, why are you asking a bird his name? Because ravens, crows, by the way, do have the ability to parrot, essentially. They're one of the most intelligent birds and also one of the most intelligent animals. And they can parrot really nicely back. So you can actually train them to speak back to you. Now, is that what was being referenced here? I'm not sure. Or is this just the narrator kind of like, I don't know, playing with the wildlife, or kind of fancifully playing with the world around him, saying, talking to an animal that he knows cannot comprehend him? I don't know. We're not totally sure. And, again, the fact that it is something that's interrupting his solitude, is this it? Kind of that he's trying to just talk to somebody, talk to something instead of the darkness. Is it an accident also, by the way, that, this thing comes when he's sitting there sorry about Lenore, then in comes a raven, in comes a thing of life after he kind of like spoke out into the darkness, maybe. The night's Plutonian shore. Why Plutonian? What do you mean? Why are we referencing the planets? Well, once again, Edgar Allan Poe is making an allusion to Greco-Roman mythology. Plutonian, of course, refers to Pluto, which is now no longer a planet, but was associated as a heavenly body linked with the god of the underworld, Pluto, Hades. Okay, so you're wandering from the night's Plutonian shore, from the shores of the underworld. Okay, very clearly kind of linking with that idea of the external darkness, of death, of all this kind of stuff. The Plutonian shore, is this a reference to the river Styx, right? Possibly, where there's that shore that we cross over into the underworld in the ancient Roman and Greek myths, where you no longer can come from. Is that where he's from? I don't know. Let's read on. Also, by the way, what is his name? His name, he says, is Nevermore. Clearly, I don't think that that's meant to literally be his name, because the thing can't comprehend what the narrator is asking him. But he's just saying nevermore, which means what? He heard the phrase nevermore somewhere. Okay. The bird has heard that phrase, as the narrator is going to understand in a minute. So just keep that in mind. We have this nevermore. Kind of a grim word in the context that we're in, right? Never again is kind of how we would translate that, never again, never again. It's like, sounds a little bit negative in its tone, certainly has a rather negative effect on our mood. Let's take a look. Much I marveled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevance it bore, for we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculpted bust above his chamber door, with such a name as Nevermore. In other words, like, okay, that's kind of weird. I don't really buy that that has much meaning. Interesting. Why is its name Nevermore? I don't know. So the narrator's, kind of asking the same questions we are. What's up with that? But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one word he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, other friends have flown before, on the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before. Then the bird said, nevermore. Okay. So he's like, yeah, okay, kind of cool, whatever, fine. Other friends have flown before. This has happened before. Other birds have come in here. He'll leave me, just like my hopes. Okay, expressing not just an address to the situation at hand, but also linking it kind of with his own depression. Right. I think he's very clearly suffering from at least sort of some depressive symptoms here. And what then happens? The bird responds, nevermore. Now, that's kind of weird because, like, let's look at the literal answer and response here, or a question and response. The narrator says, yeah, others have flown before. He's going to leave me just like my hopes have. And the bird says, nevermore. Implying what? The bird will never leave him? I don't know. Startled at the stillness broken by a reply so aptly spoken, doubtless, said I, what it utters is its only stock in store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melody did, that melancholy burden bore off nevermore. So he assumes, okay, that must be the only word that it knows how to say, obviously. Must have heard it from who? From somebody who was really having a miserable life that just kept saying nevermore, nevermore. Again, like you have that pattern of like a relatively rational comprehension of what's happening, but then you kind of tack on that negative aspect to it too. It's almost like the narrator is looking for what? For a negative interpretation of the world around him, which again, linking back to that depressive sort of idea, it explains kind of how depression does work. It looks at the world through negative lenses, and it really just fixates on negative things, even as Edgar Allan Poe is showing here, to the point where it is reading negativity into the world. Possibly that's one way we could interpret this. Okay, next one. But the raven, still beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushion seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook to myself to linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore, meant in croaking nevermore. So he's doing what we're doing. He's like sitting here and he's like, what is up with this thing? Like he's trying to figure it out. And he's like, let's just kind of meditate on this. Let's analyze this bird and what this bird is doing here, right? Now, you know, what does that mean about the narrator? Does that mean the narrator, needs to get a hobby? Does that mean that the narrator is obsessed with this? Does that mean that, again, the narrator is reading things that are not there into reality? Is he projecting his own negative, depressed mood onto reality around him and then reading the signs back? Kind of like what happened with the echo, right? When he whispered out Lenore and then heard Lenore echo back to him. Is this him just kind of creating this endless loop of negative interactions with the world? Maybe. I think whatever he is doing, though, is generally unhealthy and unhelpful. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing, to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining with the lamplight gloating o'er she shall press, never more. Okay, sitting here, still contemplating the bird, divining it, right? Trying to figure out what does it mean, leaning back, and he's like, and Lenore's never going to be here again with me. So again, it's like everything reminds me of her, kind of a moment, right? Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tuffled floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee, respite, and nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore, quoth the raven, nevermore. So he imagines, or does in fact smell, the idea or the perfume of a censer, right? Kind of like a frankincense sort of image. Swung by seraphim, swung by angels. So he's like, are there angels kind of about me? And he thinks he has that kind of churchly smell, which, back then would have been, relatively common. Censers are kind of a common thing in churches, so it could easily, get, frankincense smell on your clothes, whatever. Or is it just him going nuts? We don't know. And so he hears this, and he smells this rather, and he jumps up and he's like, God, angels, like, come on, give me some break from these memories of Lenore. Stop, help me forget this lost Lenore. Then the raven replies. Notice he's speaking to the imaginary or not angels that he suspects are all about him. And he says, help me get some respite, some kind of pause and break from my memories of this woman. And the raven is the one that responds, nevermore. Okay. In other words, answering what? You will never forget Lenore. Okay. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent or whether tempest tossed the here ashore, desolate yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? Tell me, I implore, quoth the raven nevermore. So what does he kind of do? So he's yelling at that kind of angelic presence that he suspects. Then he turns and starts to yell at the raven, who he hears respond to him. He says, prophet, like, are you a prophet? If you're a thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent or whether tempest tossed the here ashore. In other words, are you a prophet? Are you a tempter, something sent by the tempter, sent by the devil? Or are you just something that's just here randomly, desolate on the haunted, on this desert land enchanted, by this home by horror haunted, in this terrible horror haunted home of mine? Tell me, what is going on? Is there balm in Gilead? In other words, is there a balm for me? Gilead is, of course, a reference to an Old Testament story. We don't need to get into that now. But the request for a balm, is there any healing for me? Right? Tell me, I implore. The raven says, nevermore. Okay? Nevermore. In other words, no, there is no respite for you. Okay? Now, at that point, you had to kind of ask, why are you expecting the raven to say anything else? Why are you essentially setting up a negative response, right? It's like, you have a bird that only says one thing, no, and it's like you purposefully go up and ask the thing, hey, will I ever be happy? No. Hey, will I ever have a good life? No. It's like, well, you know that all it's going to say is this, and yet he is still interpreting it as meaningful. Okay. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by the heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow laden, if within the distant Aidenn, it shall clasp a sainted maiden, whom the angels name Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels name Lenore, quoth the raven nevermore. Again, he's feeding deeper and deeper into that negativity. He's still kind of conflating the two now. He's saying, prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, right? So now it's an evil prophet. He knows it is. He knows what it's going to say is no, and he's still kind of like teeing up this negative response. Okay, be that word or sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked, upstarting. Get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie that soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart and take thy form from off my door. In other words, get the hell out of here. Now, he says, leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my token. Take thy beak from my heart. Leave the door from the door. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Fervently, emotionally calling the raven or commanding the raven to leave, shrieking at him, right? Telling him, leave, get out. Don't leave any sign that you were here because you're speaking lies, right? Lies. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Put the bust upon my door. Take thy beat from off my heart, right? Get out of here. And the raven says nevermore. Okay. Assuming that it doesn't move also, just sits there. Okay. And then we get the final stanza. How does this very strange poem conclude? And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door. And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted evermore. Okay. So he tries to get the thing out of there. It doesn't. It says nevermore. And then the final lines of the poem are no more dialogue with the raven. It's just a statement from the narrator. The raven never flitting. In other words, it's still sitting there, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas above my chamber door. So it's there. It's not leaving. It's just sitting there. And it's sitting on the bust of Pallas, right? And his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, right? So he has this kind of like, demonic sort of eye, like just bearing into the narrator. And the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor. So that shadow is kind of like cast over him, right? And my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. My soul shall be lifted. In other words, I shall never will be lifted nevermore, and thus I will never what? Have a lifted soul, have a lightened heart, have joy, have peace, have happiness, all this stuff, nevermore. Okay. That is interesting. So the narrator there in that final line is sort of crying out in despair, okay, saying he's never going to be happy again. It is a sort of hopeless, relatively hopeless, and just outcry of despair and depression and sadness. Okay. Now, because interestingly, because the raven is not moving, and what does that mean, by the way? Let's actually break that down and move into the question. So, what's the point? What's going on in this poem, right? A couple of different things. Is this merely the outcrying of Poe's kind of depressed mood? Is he kind of just giving us a narrator who is just kind of venting out his depression onto the world? Possibly. It could just be a simple expressive poem. Is the poem playing around with the narrator's behavior with the raven? Is it's showing us how this man's kind of insanity, if you want to call it that, or this man's lack of rational thinking, let's put it that way, is really kind of confusing him and leading him down a sort of spiraled uh, descent into depressed madness, essentially. Which, by the way, that whole idea of an unreliable narrator is totally familiar to Poe. Many of his short stories adopt such a narrator, so that would be fine. That would be actually quite on par for him. Now, is it that? Is it us getting the insight into this kind of man's despairing mind? Possibly. Or is it meant to be a reliable, kind of symbolic narrator, kind of telling us, sharing with us an accurate depiction of how despair has entered into and is now dominating his life, symbolically in the form of that raven? I'm not totally sure. It's quite an interesting poem to kind of find which way you want to read it with. It's just filled with, as you can see, illusions. It's filled with symbolism. It's filled with a lot of really interesting elements. So really quickly, identify the rhyme scheme and what effect does it create? Well, you might have noticed like it has a really wonderful kind of repetitive and kind of like monotonous, almost monotonous, but kind of not sing-songy, but just like beating sort of movement in it, in its sound. So what effect does this create? Repetitive, echoing. I think that's kind of the idea that Poe is going for. This kind of like echoing, sort of never-ending beating. This do-doon, 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 do-doon. It's going again and again and again. What effect does this create? Not a sing-songy one like Baron and Luthien. It's meant to be something that's almost annoying, right? My mind, of course, jumps right to the Telltale Heart, which is about, yeah, the beating of a heart. Possibly kind of what he's drawing on there too. Possibly. So, three elements that are being used. Well, we saw repetition used a ton here. We saw symbolism really, really heavily used. Mood is just kind of like oozing out of this poem. This poem is just so intense with the mood. You see a lot of like symbolism. We see allusions, right? The clear allusions to biblical and Greek sort of texts. You see also here, what else? Quite a bit of, how would I want to phrase this? First person point of view narration, right? You see an interesting interplay with how do we supposed to interpret what the narrator is interpreting, right? Because we could be totally cynical and be like, yeah, the narrator is totally insane and we can't trust what he's saying. He's just looking at basic kind of next to meaningless things and drawing way too much meaning out of it and causing himself to go more and more insane. Maybe that's how you should read it. Okay, so point of view, illusion, symbolism, characterization all over the place, mood, probably the dominant one I would say of this entire poem. So a lot of stuff coming out of this poem. Now, what is the potential, or what are some possible themes of this poem? Well, again, it depends on how you interpret it. Is this a poem that is simply Edgar Allan Poe's expression of his own despair? If that's what it is, then that's a pretty just damp sort of theme where it's like, okay, life is really, really full of awful things, and that there are some inevitable and permanent ends to things, right? That you just need to kind of, I don't know, be overwhelmed with despair. That's one way to look at it, right? Again, relatively dark, and that's Poe, right? Now, mm, I'm somewhat suspicious of that because Edgar Allan Poe, while being a very macabre writer, I wouldn't go so far as to say he's like this a nihilist at that point. All right, he sounds nihilistic at some points, but I think that's a conflation of terms. A nihilist, of course, being someone who thinks that there is no purpose, meaning, value, or any hope in life. So just depression on steroids. Now, I don't think that's him. I think that'd be inaccurate to say that's what's going on here. Somewhat, at least. I think you can make an argument for that, but I don't think that's necessarily an easy case to make. I think personally what he's doing is closer to the narrator trick that he usually does. And he's giving us an insight into a narrator's mind. And it's a narrator who is looking at the world through a very, very thick lens of despair and sadness and depression. And as a result, he can't see anything properly. And what he does see is sort of just negative and then fed back into his interpretation as negative. So he kind of spirals into this sort of sad mentality and this despairing mentality. I think that's kind of closer to the theme. So if you want to articulate that more clearly, the theme of Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven is something like what? Despair can distort the way that we view the world. Or if you want to make it more dark than that, you could say despair is what is the dominant sort of force in the world, right? Sadness and despair and the, what do you want to call it? Impermanence of life, hence Lenore's death, is the dominant force in life. And no wisdom can kind of overcome it, right? That's adopting the narrator's interpretation here. If we want to adopt him and think that he's trustworthy, then that's the conclusion that we draw, because we see the bird, of death coming from the Plutonian shore, from the afterlife, dominating the god of wisdom and the god of protection, showing us that what kind of like the cask or kind of like the Mask of the Red Death, right? The death is illimitable and indomitable. Possibly, that's one way we could look at this. Again, another theme would be that no, it's your if you allow despair to really kind of lay hold of you, it will distort the way you interpret reality and the world around you. Okay, so that's The Raven. Very, as you can tell, very rich. You can kind of get a feel, a flavor for why it is Edgar Allan Poe's probably most famous and most beloved poem. It's very, very rich in its meaning. I didn't even really come relatively close to scratching the depth of how you could analyze each of those lines and stanzas, but that's okay. We have a lot of other things to do and move on with in the class. So I encourage you, if you really like it, go listen to better people read it and analyze it. There's a lot of good materials on it out there. And in the meantime, we are going to move forward with analyzing and comparing Baron and Luthien and Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. So really quickly, if you actually look on the back of that poetry mapping sheet, you will see this. I don't know what just happened to mine. If you look at this particular sheet, what you will see is we're going to do a quick write again. So a little bit of a shorter quick write. I'm going to have us do essentially a comparative analysis of both poems. Let's take a look at what it says. Compare how each poem utilizes various literary elements to illustrate their respective themes and central ideas. Let's do this. Let's actually edit this and take out central ideas. I don't really think we need to talk about that at an 11th grade level. Which poem does this more effectively in your assessment and why? Be sure to explain what elements are being used and to what effect, giving at least 4 pieces of textual evidence overall. So you can probably do this in about, I think 3 at most paragraphs. You could kind of give me the intro where you explain what literary elements did Tolkien use to illustrate his theme in Baron and Luthien? And then what literary elements did Poe use to illustrate his theme in The Raven? And you can actually kind of see how there's some relationship to both of them in terms of theme. I mean, obviously, Tolkien's is way more positive. Tolkien's does also deal with sorrow and potential loss, but it's very hopeful and very beautiful and healing at the end of it. Whereas The Raven is much more cynical and much more confusing in some regard, but generally pessimistic overall. Okay, so how did they do that? How did they create these different themes? What elements did they really use, and to what effect? And I'm asking you to tell me which did so more effectively. Did Tolkien do a better job conveying his theme than Edgar Allan Poe? Or did Poe do a better job than Tolkien? Explain to me who did it better, essentially. That should be maybe like the last part of your analysis. I'm more interested in you telling me exactly like, well, what was their theme and like what really kind of sold us on that. I'll give you a hint. Like in Tolkien, it's really clear that imagery is playing such a big role here in what he's doing and kind of the beauty and the effect of nature and life and all this kind of stuff. That's a big point there. You could also say that characterization is also a big thing that Tolkien uses in Beren and Luthien. You could also say that, aside from just that, you could also say that, what was the one I didn't use? I always forget this last one. That conflict is also one that Tolkien is using, right? It's the big three: conflict, imagery, and characterization. He really just kind of leans into those. The characterization, or rather the conflict that we see in Beren and Luthien's story ends up kind of contributing to why it's such a fulfilling kind of and beautiful passage or beautiful poem, rather. And then with Edgar Allan Poe, I think it's really clear that he's using point of view to confuse us quite a bit about the way that we need to interpret this poem. He's using a lot of symbolism, that's for sure, and he's also using characterization, like the way that the narrator is being characterized. Okay, so those are some ideas of what you could talk about. Again, you only need to use 4 pieces of textual evidence. You need to mention 4 specific quotes at some point and just talk about like, oh, here's 2 from Tolkien, here's 2 from Poe, and explain, generally who was the more successful author with these 2 respective poems and why. Okay, that's all we effectively got to do. Again, if you need some further clarification on that, go refer back to our writing instructions or kind of our videos on writing, our universal materials on writing and how to do that sort of stuff, just to kind of guide you away from some basic errors that we might make. Okay, so that's that. I will see you next time when we begin to cover, I believe it is another Edgar Allan Poe short story, which is, of course, The Telltale Heart. So we're going to be revisiting that and then doing a little bit of biblical literature alongside it. All right. Thank you very much and have an outstanding day. I will see you soon. Bye.